That morning didn't feel important. The harbor lights were still on, the boats were already moving, and my coffee tasted the same as always. I wasn't in a crisis. I wasn't late. Nothing was wrong until I opened the weekly revenue report. One line was missing. Not delayed, not pending, just gone. I didn't panic. I didn't swear. I just stared at the number that shouldn't have been there and felt something go very quiet inside me. If you've ever trusted the wrong people a little too much, stay with me. And if this story resonates, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. They called me the independent one. That was the word everyone used. Reliable, stable, low maintenance. I lived in a harbor city on the West Coast, where the mornings smelled like salt and diesel and the work never really stopped. My job was tied to the family dock, paperwork, schedules, revenue reports, things that didn't look dramatic from the outside, but kept everything running. I paid my bills on time. I didn't ask for help. I didn't cause scenes. That seemed to make everyone very comfortable. When relatives talked about me, it was always with a kind of pride that carried relief underneath it. Maya's fine. Maya's got it handled. Maya doesn't need much. And slowly, without anyone ever announcing it, responsibility began to slide off their shoulders and land on mine. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started with small assumptions. Since I lived closest to the dock, I handled the paperwork. Since I understood the numbers, I managed the accounts. Since I wasn't struggling, I could cover gaps when things were tight. No one said I had to. They just stopped offering. I remember my father telling someone, "She's independent. Always has been." He said it like a compliment. I nodded, because that's what I always did. Independence sounded like strength, but it also became a reason not to check in. No one asked if I was tired. No one asked if the pressure was getting heavy. They just trusted that I'd figure it out. And I did. Every time. There's a moment in a lot of families when a child starts taking care of themselves. They earn money. They solve problems. They stop asking questions. From the outside, it looks like growth. From the inside, it often looks like silence. When you prove you can stand on your own, people assume you want to stand alone. They confuse capability with consent. They treat your strength like permission. That's the part no one warns you about. The more dependable I became, the less visible my needs were. Not because I hid them well, but because no one was looking anymore. If something went wrong, it was implied I'd handle it. If something needed signing, it came to me. If something needed fixing quietly, I was the safe option. I didn't protest. I told myself this was just adulthood. But adulthood isn't supposed to feel like being slowly evacuated from your own support system. I noticed the shift most clearly during family conversations. When problems came up, people would glance at me without saying my name. Decisions would be made with the assumption that I'd adapt. And I always did. That's how the word independent changed meaning. It stopped describing my ability. It started excusing their absence. No one pulled away dramatically. There were no arguments, no ultimatums, just a gradual disappearance of backup. If you're independent, you don't need protecting. If you don't need protecting, you don't need asking. If you don't need asking, your agreement is assumed. That's how lines blur. I didn't realize how much had shifted until much later, when I tried to trace the moment responsibility stopped being shared. There wasn't one, just a pattern. And patterns are harder to confront than single betrayals. Looking back, I can see how often I was praised right before something was handed to me. "You're so capable. You're the strong one. We couldn't do this without you." Those words sound supportive. They can also be a way out. Because when everyone agrees you're the strong one, no one feels guilty letting you carry more. If you're listening to this and thinking, that sounds familiar, you're not alone. A lot of people grow up learning that being low maintenance keeps the peace, that being reliable makes you valuable, that asking for less makes you easier to keep around. What no one tells you is the cost. Strength, when it's never checked on, becomes a hiding place for neglect. I didn't think of myself as abandoned. That word felt too dramatic. I was still included, still consulted, still praised. But inclusion without protection is just access. And by the time I noticed how alone I'd become inside the system, everyone else had already adjusted to that version of me. The version who handled things quietly, the version who didn't ask. If you had asked me then whether anything was wrong, I would have said no, because nothing was wrong in the obvious way. Things were just shifted. And shifts, left unspoken, have consequences. I didn't know that yet. I just knew I was tired. The help didn't start with anything dramatic. It never does. The first time, it was just paperwork. A form slid across the table at the dock office, coffee rings on the corner. They said it would be easier if we both had access. Easier to manage. Easier to move things quickly when boats were coming in late. I signed. I told myself it wasn't giving anything up. It was just sharing access. A few months later, there was another favor. A short-term gap in cash flow. Nothing serious. Fuel costs went up. A shipment came in underweight. They needed a buffer, just for a week or two. I covered it. No receipt, no written note, just a verbal, "We'll square it up." We always did. Until we didn't. At the time, it didn't feel like losing control. It felt like being useful. I was close by. I understood the numbers. I didn't panic when things went wrong. So the requests kept coming, spaced far enough apart that they never felt connected. One signature here, one transfer there, one temporary workaround that quietly became permanent. No one ever framed it as taking. It was always framed as helping. Helping the family, helping the business, helping keep things afloat. And I believed that difference mattered. There's a line people don't talk about, though. A line between help that's chosen and help that's assumed. I didn't see when I crossed it. I only know that at some point. No one asked anymore. They informed. They'd say things like, "You're already on the account," or "You handle this stuff anyway," or "It's simpler if it goes through you." Always practical, always reasonable, always one step further than last time. If you had asked me then whether I felt taken advantage of, I would have said no, because nothing was taken all at once. It was handed over in pieces, with explanations attached. And explanations are persuasive. I remember the first time I noticed money move without a heads up. Not a huge amount. Something small enough to ignore. I assumed I'd missed a message or forgotten a conversation. I didn't say anything. That became a pattern too. When help stays invisible, so do the boundaries. There's a difference between generosity and access, but it's subtle. Generosity has an off switch. Access doesn't. I was still telling myself I was in control. I was still the one logging in, checking reports, balancing columns. That illusion lasted a long time. What I didn't realize was that control had already shifted. Quietly, legally, incrementally. Once money and permission mix, the relationship changes shape. It stops being about trust and starts being about leverage. But no one announces that moment. It just happens while you're focused on keeping things running. I kept a notebook back then, not for evidence, just for work, numbers, dates, notes in the margins. I didn't know I was documenting anything important. I was just trying to stay organized. Looking back, those pages tell a story I wasn't ready to read yet. Each entry looks harmless on its own. Together, they form a pattern, a slow erosion of consent disguised as cooperation. That's the danger of being the dependable one. You don't notice the weight increasing because you're used to carrying things. People assume that if you don't complain, you're comfortable. If you don't push back, you agree. Silence gets interpreted as permission. I wasn't saying yes anymore. I was just not saying no. And there's a difference. The hardest part to admit wasn't that money was moving. It was that my role had changed without my participation. I was no longer a contributor. I was infrastructure. If you're listening to this and thinking about times you've stepped in just for now, ask yourself something. Did you know how to stop? Did anyone ever check whether you wanted to continue? Help becomes exploitation when the exit disappears. No one likes to think of family that way. I didn't either. I told myself it was temporary, that once things stabilized, it would all be reset. But nothing resets itself. The system adjusts to whatever you tolerate. By the time I felt uneasy, everyone else was comfortable. The arrangements had been normalized. Questioning them felt disruptive, unnecessary, almost rude. So I stayed quiet. I kept working. I kept signing. I kept covering gaps. And every unrecorded favor made the next one easier to justify. That's how financial abuse hides. Not in theft, but in familiarity. Not in force, but in expectation. It doesn't look like a crime. It looks like loyalty. Until you try to step back. I didn't know yet what would happen when I finally did. I just knew something had shifted, and I couldn't trace it to a single moment. Only a trail of small decisions that were never written down. And once things aren't written down, they're easy to rewrite. I didn't have the language for that then. I just had a feeling. A quiet one. The kind you ignore because everything still looks fine on the surface. For a while, the first help didn't look like help. It looked like efficiency. One afternoon, I was standing in the dock office with cold hands and a pen that didn't belong to me. Someone had pushed a packet of forms across the desk like it was a menu. They said it would make things smoother if there were 2 names on the operating account. Quicker deposits, faster fuel payments, fewer delays when boats came in after hours. Just in case, my dad said. I signed. I didn't feel generous. I felt practical. The next ask came a month later, when a boat needed repairs and the mechanic wouldn't wait for the next payout cycle. It was a number small enough to forget. A bridge loan, a favor. They promised it would be back in my account before I even noticed it was gone. I transferred it. No paperwork, no email, no note, just, thank you. You're a lifesaver. And I believed that meant something. That's how it always started. A compliment, a quick request. A soft landing on my shoulders because I had the space to carry it. Then there was the winter storm that tore up 2 berths and cracked a piling near the main walkway. Insurance was slow. The season was tight. Lena was between things again. My dad's voice got quieter when he asked, like volume could turn the request into something smaller. It's temporary, he said. Just until we get through this. I said yes. I told myself this is what families do. I didn't realize I was being trained to skip the question that mattered. Not, do they need it, but do I have a choice? When you're the steady one, requests come dressed as assumptions. They arrive like weather. Like, of course this will happen, and of course you will adapt. I became the person who fixed gaps. Not because I was asked to, because nobody wanted the gap to exist. And once you plug a hole once, the system builds around you as if you'll always be there. One of the things I handled was the weekly revenue report. It was boring. Line items, dock fees, ice deliveries, maintenance holds, fuel advances, the kind of numbers that don't make people emotional, unless they're missing. I kept a small notebook in my tote bag, just a cheap one with a bent cover, dates, payments, notes like boat 3 late or invoice resent. It wasn't a diary. It was survival. It helped me remember what was supposed to happen when everyone else forgot. I didn't know I was keeping evidence. I thought I was keeping order. Then one day, a transaction showed up that I didn't recognize. Not huge, not dramatic, just unfamiliar. I stared at it for a long second, then did what I always did. I assumed I'd missed a conversation. I assumed I'd agreed and forgotten. I assumed it was easier to be wrong than to be suspicious. So I didn't say anything. That was the first consequence. Silence has consequences. The next time it happened, it was a little larger. It had a note attached that sounded official. Operational adjustment, dock expenses, words that made it feel normal, words that made it hard to challenge without sounding paranoid. I asked my dad casually, like I was checking the weather. He didn't look up from his coffee. "Oh yeah," he said. "We had to move things around. Don't worry about it." And because he said don't worry, I didn't. If you were me, what would you have done? Would you have pushed harder over a single line item? Would you have risked being labeled dramatic over something you couldn't fully prove yet? That was the trap. Nothing was big enough to justify a confrontation. Everything was just small enough to swallow. And every time I swallowed, the expectation grew. This is the part people misunderstand about financial abuse. They picture a masked thief. They picture a screaming fight. They picture a villain. Most of the time, it looks like cooperation. It looks like we're all in this together. But help is supposed to come with an exit. Real help has a door you can walk back through. It's the difference between, "Can you cover this once?" and "You always cover this." It's the difference between a request and a routine. At some point, I stopped being asked. I was notified. "Hey, we used the account for this." "Hey, we moved some money for that." "Hey, you're already authorized. So it's fine." I heard the same phrase over and over. It's fine. That phrase is a blanket. People throw over things they don't want examined. I started noticing how often help came with a guilt hook attached. If I hesitated, the tone changed. Not angry. Disappointed. Like I was failing a test I didn't remember signing up for. "You're the only one who understands this stuff. We can't afford delays. We're family." Maya. That last one was always the hardest, because it didn't sound like a reason. It sounded like a law. I watched the pattern form in real time. Every time a problem appeared, the solution was to reach for the person with the most stability. Me. My name. My access. My calm. And I let it happen, because I didn't want the dock to fail. I didn't want the business to collapse. I didn't want my father to look panicked. I didn't want Lena to fall apart again. I thought I was protecting everyone, but protection without boundaries turns into permission. And permission turns into entitlement faster than you can say no. Here's the line I didn't see until later. Helping is when you can say no and still be loved. Abuse is when saying no becomes a punishment. When you start losing warmth for asking questions. When you start losing peace for wanting clarity. When money becomes a measure of loyalty. I didn't have words for it then. I just had this feeling that I was alone inside a system that kept calling itself family. Alone, but accessible. Alone, but responsible. And the more alone I felt, the more I tried to control things with process. More notes, more spreadsheets, more double-checking. I told myself if I could just stay organized, nothing bad would happen. That was another consequence. Control became my coping mechanism. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't accuse. I didn't slam doors. I did what I always did. I kept the dock running. I kept the peace. I kept swallowing the small things because the big things hadn't happened yet. But the big things don't arrive out of nowhere. They arrive on top of all the small things you never wrote down. And that morning, when I opened the report and saw that missing line, my notebook was still in my bag. My coffee was still warm. The harbor was still moving like it always did. And I realized I didn't just need answers. I needed evidence. Because without evidence, there were no consequences. And without consequences, help could keep changing its name forever. Lena called me on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the day I did the deposits. I was in the dock office with the heater blasting and my notebook open, trying to make the numbers match the invoices. Her name lit up on my phone. She didn't say hello the way she used to. She sounded like she was already mid-conversation, like the emergency had been happening for hours and I was late to it. "Maya, I need you," she said. I asked what happened. She told me she'd missed a payment. Rent, insurance, something that had a deadline attached to it, something that could spiral if it wasn't handled immediately. She said it fast, like speed could make it less serious. "It's not even that much," she added. "I just need you to cover it and I'll pay you back when I get my next check." I stared at the revenue report on my desk. The missing line from that morning was still in my head. The little blank space that shouldn't have been blank. The part of me that used to say yes automatically felt delayed. I asked her how many times this had happened. She went quiet for half a second. Then she laughed like I'd made a weird joke. "What do you mean?" she said. "You know I'm good for it." That was the moment I realized we had been using different definitions of good. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her. I just said, "I can't." There was a pause so clean it felt rehearsed. Then her tone changed. Not angry. Not yet. Hurt. Like I'd pushed her. "Seriously," she said. "It's family." That phrase again. Family. The word that was supposed to mean safety, but always arrived when someone wanted something from me. I took a breath. I looked out the office window at the dock. Men unloading crates. A boat horn in the distance. Normal life continuing while my chest tightened. "I can't this time," I repeated. "I'm not covering it." She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what was going on with me. She just said, "Wow," like she was taking notes on who I really was. Then she hung up. No screaming, no dramatic goodbye, just the click of the call ending and the sound of my own breathing in a small office. I didn't feel proud. I felt sick. If you've ever said no for the first time, you know that feeling. Not relief, not freedom. More like you've stepped off a ledge and you're waiting to see if the ground is still there. I put my phone face down. I kept working. That night, my dad didn't call. He texted. A single line. "Lena said you wouldn't help her. Is everything okay?" It wasn't a question. Not really. It was a correction. I stared at the screen for a long time before I answered. I wanted to write a paragraph. I wanted to explain the missing line. The weird transfer notes. The way my stomach had been tight for weeks. Instead, I wrote, "I'm not covering her anymore." He didn't respond right away. When he finally did, it was another single line. "She's your sister." That was it. No curiosity, no concern, just a reminder of my role. The next few days were quiet in a way that felt intentional. Lena stopped sending me memes. She stopped reacting to my messages. My dad stopped asking what time I'd be at the dock. He'd show up and talk to the guys. He'd leave without looking at me. The cold wasn't just outside anymore. It was in the room. And that's when I learned something I wish I'd learned earlier. In some families, love isn't removed loudly, it's withdrawn, like a privilege you lose when you stop being useful. I didn't chase them. I didn't apologize. I just sat with the silence and tried to tell myself I had done the right thing. Then a few weeks passed. The harbor shifted into a new season. The mornings got darker. The wind sharpened. I kept doing deposits and reconciling reports and pretending my life was still normal. I almost started believing it. Until the next revenue report came in. It was a Friday. I was tired. I had skipped lunch. My hands were cold from being outside checking a shipment. I sat down with my coffee and opened the file like I'd done 100 times before. And there it was. Another missing line. Not a delay. Not an accounting error. A movement. A withdrawal. A transfer with a note that sounded like it belonged there. Operational. Adjustment. I stared at it until the words stopped looking like words, because the timing mattered. This wasn't from before I said no. This was after. After the call. After the silence. After my father's text. After I made the boundary clear. They had still moved money. They had still used access that wasn't supposed to be used without me. I didn't slam my laptop shut. I didn't storm out. I just sat very still, and I felt the truth settle into place with the weight of something final. My no hadn't been heard as a boundary. It had been heard as an inconvenience. If you were me, what would you think in that moment? Would you still call it family stress? Would you still call it a misunderstanding? Or would you finally name it for what it was? Because at that point, it stopped being about Lena needing help. It became about someone deciding that my consent was optional. And when consent becomes optional, the next step is always the same: consequences. I opened my notebook. I wrote the date at the top of the page. And for the first time, I didn't write it like a work note. I wrote it like evidence. Because the system wasn't going to stop just because I asked it to. It was going to stop when it had to. Money stopped feeling like money the moment I stopped reacting to it emotionally. That's when I knew something was wrong. After the second withdrawal, I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront. I didn't ask for explanations. I did something quieter. I started pulling records. Not just recent ones, older ones. Files I hadn't opened in years. Reports saved under boring names. Emails I'd skimmed and archived without thinking. I did it at my kitchen table, late at night, with the dock quiet and my phone turned face down. The first thing I noticed wasn't the missing money. It was how clean everything looked. Too clean. Transactions labeled as operational, adjustments timed perfectly between payout cycles, nothing sloppy, nothing impulsive. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. That's when I stopped thinking in terms of stress or mistakes and started thinking in terms of systems. I went back further. Before the first time Lena needed help, before the winter storm, before I was officially added to the account for convenience, that's when I found it. A document tied to the dock's operating license, buried in a folder I hadn't touched since my 20s. A guarantee. My name. My signature. Old enough that I barely remembered signing it. It wasn't a loan. It was leverage. The dock hadn't just been using my accounts to patch holes. It had been quietly tied to my name for years. Used as collateral. Not activated. Not obvious. Just waiting. I sat there for a long time with the paper in my hands, feeling strangely calm. If you were me, what would you feel in that moment? Anger, maybe. But what I felt was clarity. This wasn't about helping Lena. This wasn't about a rough season. This was about risk being parked on my back long before I ever agreed to carry it. I kept reading. Every time things got tight, there was a pattern. Not just transfers, but positioning. Money moved here so it could be accessed there. Permissions adjusted quietly. Language that sounded temporary but never actually expired. That's when it clicked. I hadn't been helping in emergencies. I had been serving as insurance. When money is just money, people argue about fairness. When money becomes collateral, everything changes. Collateral doesn't get thanked. Collateral doesn't get asked. Collateral gets used. I realized then that my value in the system wasn't emotional. It was structural. I wasn't the daughter they protected. I was the buffer that absorbed impact. Every time the business wobbled, the shock traveled to me, and every time I stayed quiet, the system learned it could. This is the part people don't like to hear. Feelings don't stop systems. Disappointment doesn't stop systems. Even saying no doesn't stop a system that's already learned how to bypass you. Only evidence does. Only documentation creates consequences. I stopped reading and opened my notebook. The same cheap one I'd been using for years. This time, I didn't write reminders. I wrote timelines, dates, amounts, names, what was authorized, what wasn't, what happened before I said no, what happened after. I wasn't building a case. I was mapping a pattern. And patterns tell the truth even when people don't. The more I documented, the clearer it became. This wasn't a one-time breach of trust. This was a long-term strategy that assumed my silence. I thought back to all the moments I'd been praised for being steady, all the times my independence had been mentioned like a shield. Now I saw what it really was. Cover. Calling it family made it easier to ignore the risk. Calling me strong made it easier to place that risk on me. That's when money stopped being emotional. It stopped being about guilt, or generosity, or loyalty. It became data. And data doesn't care how much you love someone. Data just shows what happened. I didn't cry. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt focused. Because once you understand that you've been used as collateral, the story changes. It's no longer about whether they meant to hurt you. It's about whether the system can continue to exist without you propping it up. And that question doesn't get answered with feelings. It gets answered with consequences. I closed the folder. I shut my notebook. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't wondering what they would say when I confronted them. I was wondering how far this went. Because when money isn't just money anymore, the truth is usually deeper than you expect. And I had a feeling this wasn't the last thing I was going to find. The realization didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. Standing at the dock before sunrise, watching the water pull against the ropes. Sitting alone at my kitchen table with cold coffee, reading the same documents for the third time, not because I didn't understand them, but because I didn't want to. I kept thinking there had to be another explanation, a misunderstanding, a bad decision made under pressure, something temporary that went too far. But the more I looked at it, the more one thing became clear. I wasn't in the center of this family. I was underneath it. All those years I thought I was being trusted. What I actually was relied on. There's a difference. Trust is shared. Reliance is placed. When I was younger, people called me responsible, capable, independent. I wore those words like armor. I thought they meant I was valued. Now I understood what they really meant. I was predictable. I didn't panic. I didn't explode. I didn't disappear. When things went wrong, I absorbed the shock quietly and kept moving. That made me useful, not cherished. Useful. I thought about all the times no one checked in on me, all the decisions that were made without asking what it would cost me, all the risks that somehow landed in my lap without a conversation. None of it felt malicious in isolation. That's the part that messes with your head. No single moment where someone says, "We're going to use you." Just a series of choices that only make sense if you're not seen as someone who needs protection. I wasn't betrayed because I was weak. I was betrayed because I was steady, because I didn't make noise, because I kept the dock running, the money flowing, the problems contained. I wasn't the daughter they worried about. I was the anchor they tied everything to when the tide got rough, and anchors don't get asked if they're tired. They're expected to hold. If you were me, what would you do with that realization? It's not dramatic. It's quiet. It changes the way you remember everything. Moments that once felt like praise start to look like preparation. Compliments turn into permissions. Silence turns into expectation. I stopped asking myself why they didn't protect me. I started asking a harder question. What would happen to them if I stopped holding everything in place? That question didn't feel vengeful. It felt honest. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix the system. I was looking at it, really looking. And once you see your role clearly, you can't unsee it. I wasn't the problem. I was the solution they never planned to replace. That's when the illusion broke. Not with anger, with clarity. I closed my notebook and leaned back in my chair, listening to the sounds of the harbor drift through the window. Gulls, engines, water moving against wood. The dock had always been there. So had I. But one of us was replaceable, and one of us wasn't supposed to carry the weight of everyone else's choices. I didn't feel small in that moment. I felt separate, like I was standing just outside the story I'd been telling myself my whole life. And from there, I could finally see it for what it was. I wasn't failing my family. I was outgrowing the role they had quietly assigned me. I wasn't walking away from love. I was stepping out from under a structure that only worked as long as I stayed silent. I didn't say any of this out loud. I didn't need to. Because once you understand you're the anchor, the next step isn't confrontation, it's choice. And I hadn't made mine yet. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to keep holding everything together just so it wouldn't fall apart. Some things only end when you stop carrying them. And I was finally ready to let the weight go. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make calls. I didn't send long messages asking for explanations. I didn't demand apologies. I opened a notebook. That was it. The first thing I wrote down was a date. The second was a number. Then another date. Another number. I went back through old reports I hadn't looked at in years. Monthly summaries, annual filings, notes I had skimmed because everything seemed fine at the time. I stopped skimming. I printed things. Highlighted lines. Wrote questions in the margins, not accusations. Questions. When did this change? Who signed this? Why wasn't I copied? I kept my tone neutral, even in my own head, because this wasn't about anger anymore. It was about evidence. I noticed patterns I hadn't seen before. Small withdrawals that lined up with other people's emergencies. Temporary permissions that never expired. Paperwork that was just for convenience but carried weight I hadn't understood back then. I felt stupid for a moment. Then I let that go. You can't judge past decisions with information you didn't have. So I kept going. I pulled licenses, operating agreements, old emails saved in dusty folders. I compared timestamps, checked signatures, looked at who benefited and who carried the risk. The story stopped being emotional. It started being factual. That's when things shifted. Not for me, for them. They noticed the questions first, not the accusations. The questions. Why are you asking about that now? Is something wrong? You're overthinking this. I didn't answer right away. I just kept writing. If you were me, would you have said something earlier? I used to think silence was kindness. Now I saw it differently. Silence had protected everyone but me. The first real reaction came when I requested copies of documents I technically already had access to. Nothing dramatic, just formal, just documented. The tone changed overnight. Calls came in faster, voices sharper, explanations longer. No one asked how I was doing. They asked what I was doing. I realized then that clarity scares people more than anger. Anger can be dismissed. Clarity has consequences. I wasn't threatening anyone. I wasn't even planning anything yet. I was recording reality. And that was enough to make the system shake. They tried guilt first. You're tearing the family apart. Why are you doing this to us? We thought you understood. I wrote those down too. Dates, words, context. I noticed how often the focus shifted away from the facts and onto my tone, my timing, my loyalty. That told me everything I needed to know, because when facts are solid, people argue facts. When they aren't, they argue character. I kept my voice steady, my responses short, sometimes non-existent. I let the documents speak. I remember one night, sitting at my table, surrounded by papers, the fridge humming behind me. I hadn't eaten in hours, not because I was stressed, because I was focused. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I wasn't doing this to punish anyone. I was doing it to stop lying to myself. There's a difference. And deep down, they knew it. That's why the pressure escalated. Sudden concern, sudden offers to fix things, sudden insistence that we should all sit down and talk. Talk had never protected me before. Records might. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. The timeline was already written. All I was doing was making it visible. That's when I understood something important. Justice doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives slowly, when the story can no longer be denied, when the consequences are no longer hypothetical, when the weight shifts from the person who's been carrying it to the system that created it. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded, because for the first time, the truth wasn't trapped inside my head. It was on paper, and paper doesn't forget. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was creating a record that couldn't be rewritten. And once the truth exists outside of you, it stops eating you alive. That's when I knew the outcome had already changed. Not because I had won, but because the rules had. And this time, they couldn't pretend not to notice. Things didn't explode all at once. They cracked, slowly, quietly, in places no one was watching. Once the facts were no longer private, the system started turning on itself, not because I pushed it, because it had been held together by silence for too long. People who had always been protected suddenly had to explain themselves. People who had always decided suddenly had to answer questions. I watched it happen from the outside, and for the first time. I didn't step in to stabilize anything. If you were me, would you have? At first, it looked like confusion, then frustration, then blame, not toward me, toward each other. Meetings that used to end quickly started running long. Conversations went in circles. Stories stopped lining up. Dates didn't match. Numbers didn't either. I wasn't invited into those conversations. That told me enough. The person who holds things together is rarely included when things start falling apart. I noticed how fast roles changed. The one who was always taken care of became the problem. The one who had always made decisions became distant. Authority didn't disappear. It fractured. And no one knew who was supposed to carry what anymore. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel relief right away either. What I felt was space. Like a pressure I'd lived with for years had finally lifted, and my body didn't know what to do without it. I slept longer, ate when I was hungry, stopped checking my phone every 10 minutes. The chaos wasn't mine to manage anymore, and that was unsettling. Because when you've been the responsible one for a long time, peace can feel like abandonment. I kept thinking I should step back in, offer clarity, smooth things over, translate between sides. That instinct didn't disappear overnight. But I remembered something. Everything I had fixed before had only delayed this moment. Some structures don't end because someone leaves. They end because the weight finally shifts to where it belongs. I thought about the version of myself who had said yes every time, who believed keeping things calm was the same as keeping things safe. I wanted to talk to that version, so I wrote her a letter, not to send, just to say the things no one else had. You weren't wrong for helping. You weren't weak for trusting. You weren't selfish for wanting things to be fair. You were just taught that your value was in holding things together. And that's not love. That's labor. I folded the paper and put it away. Outside. The harbor kept moving. Boats came in. Boats left. The water didn't care who was arguing on land. That steadiness reminded me of something important. Not everything that collapses is a failure. Sometimes collapse is the end of pretending. The family didn't fall apart because I stopped caring. It fell apart because it had been built on uneven ground. I didn't take sides. I didn't defend myself either. There was nothing left to defend. The truth was already out there, doing its quiet work. People say closure looks like apologies, conversations, understanding. That wasn't what this looked like. This looked like distance. And distance was enough. If you're the one who always carries responsibility, this part is hard to hear. Not everyone will thank you for stopping. Some will resent you. Some will say, you changed. They're right. You did. You changed because the cost became clear. And once you see the cost, you can't unknow it. I didn't win anything. No one lost either. But the cycle ended. That matters more than victory. I stood at the dock one evening, watching the sun drop behind the cranes. The air was cold. My hands were empty. For the first time. That felt right. Some things have to fall so the carrying can stop. Some endings don't come with resolution, they come with release. And sometimes, that's the only ending that actually lasts. The transfer happened on an afternoon with no wind, the kind of day where the water barely moves, and the harbor feels suspended, like it's holding its breath. I signed the papers in a small office near the docks. No ceremony, no raised voices. Just the sound of pages turning and a pen pressed a little harder than usual. The pier didn't change hands with drama, it changed hands with clarity. I remember stepping outside afterward and noticing how normal everything looked. Boats still tied up, gulls circling, engines humming somewhere down the line. Nothing collapsed, nothing exploded. And that was the point. I didn't keep the dock, not because I couldn't, because I didn't want to carry it forward. People assume letting go means losing something, that if you don't keep what was handed down, you're rejecting your past. That wasn't what this felt like. This felt like choosing not to inherit a weight that was never meant to be mine alone. The cooperative that took over didn't see the dock as leverage or backup collateral. They saw it as a working place, a shared responsibility, something maintained, not extracted from. That difference mattered. I walked the length of the pier one last time that evening. Wood worn smooth by decades of use. Rusted cleats. Faded numbers painted near the slips. There was history there. But history doesn't have to live inside you forever. If you were me, would you have kept it for a long time? I thought keeping it was the responsible choice. The mature one. The proof that I could handle whatever came next. Now I understood something else. Responsibility doesn't mean preserving what harmed you. Sometimes it means knowing when to step away. I didn't take souvenirs. No framed photos, no old ledgers, no objects to prove I had been part of it. I didn't need proof. I had lived it. The harbor city still felt cold as the sun dropped lower, wind coming in off the water, the kind that seeps through layers if you stand still too long, but the cold didn't sit in my chest anymore. That heaviness had lifted quietly, without announcement. I went home to an apartment that didn't overlook the dock, made dinner, ate slowly, let the evening pass without checking emails or reports. For the first time in years, there was nothing I needed to monitor, no numbers to reconcile, no problems waiting for my intervention. That silence felt strange. Then it felt honest. I realized I wasn't grieving the dock. I was grieving the version of myself who believed caring everything was the same as being loved. Letting go didn't erase my past. It just stopped it from dictating my future. The city lights reflected off the water that night, broken into pieces by gentle movement. I stood at the window for a while, watching them shift. Nothing felt dramatic, but everything felt lighter. I didn't win anything. I didn't reclaim a legacy. I chose not to continue one that demanded too much and gave too little back. That choice didn't make headlines. It didn't bring closure in the way people talk about it. What it brought was space, room to breathe, room to decide who I was without an inherited role attached. The dock would keep functioning, boats would come and go, work would continue. Just not through me. And that was okay. Because some endings aren't meant to be mourned. They're meant to be completed. The harbor stayed cold, the water stayed gray, but the weight was gone. And for the first time, that felt like enough. If you're still here, I want to talk to you directly. Not as a lesson, not as advice, just as someone who stood where you might be standing now. If you're the one everyone calls independent, the one who doesn't need help, the one who always figures it out, I want you to pause for a moment and ask yourself something simple. Who does that label protect? When people say you're strong, do they step back a little when they say you've got it handled? Do they stop showing up? I didn't notice it happening at first either. It felt like respect. It felt like trust. It felt like being seen as capable. But over time, it became something else. It became an excuse not to check in, not to explain decisions, not to share the weight. If you were me, would you have questioned it earlier? I didn't. Because when you're the responsible one, questioning the system feels like failing it. You tell yourself it's temporary, that everyone's just going through something, that you can handle a little more, until a little more becomes everything. If this story felt familiar, I need you to hear this clearly. You're not imagining it. You're not ungrateful for noticing. You're not selfish for feeling tired. And you're not cruel for wanting things to be fair. There's a difference between helping and being relied on without consent. There's a difference between love and access. I didn't share this to turn anyone against their family. That was never the point. I shared it because there are people out there carrying entire systems on their backs, quietly wondering if they're the problem. You're not. What changed things for me wasn't anger. It was clarity. Clarity came when I stopped trying to explain my feelings and started paying attention to patterns, to consequences, to who benefited and who paid the price. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you get a choice. Not a loud one, a quiet one. Do you keep carrying it? Or do you set it down and let the system reveal what it really is without you holding it together? That choice doesn't make you heartless. It makes you honest. If this video made you uncomfortable, that's okay. Discomfort is often the first sign that something important is being named. If it made you feel seen, I hope you hold on to that. And if you know someone who's always fine, always handling it, always the last one standing, consider sharing this with them. Not to start a fight, but to let them know they're not crazy for feeling the way they do. You don't have to burn bridges. You don't have to confront anyone today. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop pretending you're unaffected. Clarity creates consequences, and consequences are what actually change things. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone, and you don't have to carry everything just because you always have. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. And remember, being strong doesn't mean being endless.